year was 1347. Europe had no idea death was already sailing toward its shores. Far beyond the horizon, merchant ships crossed dark waters carrying silk, spices, gold, and something far more terrifying than war itself. A silent killer, invisible, patient, unstoppable. At first, the ships looked ordinary as they drifted into the harbor of Messina beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. Dock workers prepared ropes while merchants rushed excitedly toward the port, expecting wealth from distant lands. But the moment the first sailors boarded those vessels, terror spread through the harbor like wildfire. Bodies covered the decks. Some twisted unnaturally beside broken crates. Others collapsed face first against wooden railings blackened by dried blood. Their skin had turned dark beneath the fever. Their mouths hung open in frozen agony, and strange swollen boils covered their bodies like rotting fruit beneath the flesh. The smell was unbearable. Men stumbled backward, vomiting onto the docks, while priests whispered prayers beneath trembling breath. But nobody understood the true horror hidden inside those ships. Rats torn, thousands of them. Black rats crawling silently through the cargo holds, carrying infected fleas that fed on human blood. Within days, the city began dying. At first, only a handful of people developed symptoms. A fever, weakness, pain in the joints. Then came the swellings. Large black boils appearing beneath the arms, around the neck, between the legs. Victims screamed as the infection spread through their bodies. Soon blood leaked from mouths and eyes. Skin darkened, and death followed quickly after. Sometimes within hours. Panic exploded across Europe. Nobody understood what was happening. Some believed the plague was punishment from God. Others blamed poisoned air. Rumors spread, claiming demons walked openly among humanity. Churches filled with desperate citizens, begging for salvation, while unknowingly spreading the disease even further. Everywhere, bells rang endlessly for the dead. At sunrise, carts rolled slowly through the streets, collecting corpses from houses and alleyways. The drivers no longer checked whether victims were alive. There were too many bodies, too many funerals, too many graves. Entire families vanished within days. Children died beside their parents. Mothers held lifeless infants while priests struggled to offer comfort they themselves no longer believed. The smell of death consumed entire cities. Markets emptied, shops closed, and silence replaced the sound of ordinary life. Then came the fear. Not ordinary fear, animal fear, the kind that destroys civilization itself. Neighbors turned against one another. Foreigners were attacked in the streets. People accused strangers of poisoning wells or spreading curses. Violence erupted across cities already collapsing beneath disease. Because human beings will do almost anything when surrounded by death long enough. And death was everywhere. As the plague spread deeper into Europe, doctors attempted desperately to fight the sickness. But medicine in the 14th century understood almost nothing about infection. Some physicians burned herbs beside the sick, relieving smoke, purified poisoned air. Others drained blood from patients using knives and leeches. Nothing worked. Eventually, plague doctors appeared in the streets, wearing terrifying masks shaped like birds. Long black robes covered their bodies. Leather gloves concealed their skin, and attached to their faces were hollow beaks stuffed with flowers and perfumes believed to filter disease from the air. To terrified citizens, the mask became a symbol of doom itself. When plague doctors arrived at a house, people understood what usually came next: death. But inside overcrowded hospitals, victims lay side by side screaming through fever while priests moved between beds, offering last rites faster than they could finish prayers. Some doctors fled the cities entirely. Others continued walking through corpse-filled streets like witnesses to the end of humanity itself. Outside city walls, workers dug enormous mass graves. The dead could no longer be buried individually. Bodies were stacked together in massive pits without names, without ceremony, without dignity. Some victims were still breathing weakly when thrown into the graves. No one had time to check. The smell surrounding the pits became unbearable. Smoke from burning corpses darkened the sky while terrified workers drank heavily just to continue their tasks. One grave digger later described hearing movement beneath the soil after the pits had already been covered. But fear forced everyone to continue working, because every sunrise brought more bodies. The plague moved with terrifying speed across trade routes, connecting Europe to Asia and the Middle East. City after city collapsed. Florence, Venice taught, Paris taught, London, entire villages vanished completely from existence. Fields remained abandoned because farmers were dead. Food supplies collapsed. Animals wandered empty roads beside rotting corpses left untouched in the streets. The world itself seemed infected. At night, terrified families locked themselves indoors, listening to distant screams echo through empty streets beneath church bells, ringing endlessly in the darkness. Some people became convinced the apocalypse had arrived. Others joined violent religious movements, believing pain and suffering could earn God's forgiveness. Groups known as flagellants marched through cities whipping themselves publicly while crowds followed behind, praying desperately for mercy. Blood mixed with mud beneath their feet while plague carts rolled past nearby, carrying fresh corpses toward the pits. Civilization itself began breaking apart. Laws stopped functioning. Trade collapsed. Governments weakened. Fear replaced logic. And inside that fear, humanity revealed its darkest instincts. Some abandoned sick relatives to die alone. Parents fled from infected children. Husbands locked wives inside houses beside the dead, because survival became more powerful than love. And the plague showed no mercy to anyone, rich or poor, young or old, priest or criminal. Death treated humanity equally. By the height of the Black Death, some historians believe nearly half of Europe's population had vanished. Tens of millions dead, an extinction event unfolding in real time. And still, the plague continued spreading. For years, Europe existed inside a nightmare. Then slowly, almost silently, deaths began decreasing. Not everywhere, not immediately, but gradually. The bells rang less often. The carts carried fewer bodies, and survivors cautiously emerged from their homes into a world transformed beyond recognition. Cities stood half empty. Entire bloodlines had disappeared. Mass graves remained hidden beneath the earth, and the psychological trauma left behind would haunt humanity for generations. Parents warned children about the years when death filled the streets. Artists painted horrifying visions inspired by the plague. Writers described cities drowning in silence and fear, and the image of the plague doctor became immortal, one of the most terrifying symbols in human history. But perhaps the greatest horror of the Black Death was not simply the disease itself. It was what the plague revealed about civilization, how fragile society truly is, how quickly fear destroys reason, and how thin the line separating order from chaos really becomes when humanity faces death on a massive scale. Even today, centuries later, the Black Death still lingers beneath Europe. Mass graves continue to be discovered beneath modern cities. Ancient plague bacteria remain trapped inside forgotten burial sites. And historians still uncover new evidence describing the unimaginable suffering endured during those years. Because the Black Death was not merely a pandemic, it was a wound carved into human history, a warning written in corpses, a reminder that nature can humble entire civilizations without mercy. And somewhere beneath the streets of Europe tonight, beneath crowded buildings, beneath cathedrals, beneath silent stone roads, the dead still remain, waiting in darkness, remembering the day Europe died.